Asif Ahmed, welcome to CFO Yeah.
Hi, Patrick. Hi, nice to be here.
We're very, very happy to have you. And as is customary, I'd love you to just introduce yourself to our CFO Connect audience.
Sure. Well, no, thank you for having me. As you say, my name's Asif. I am a chartered accountant. I run a firm called Acclivity Advisors. I started my career in PwC and did my chartered accountancy from there. But for the last 10 or 12 years, I've focused specifically on working with entrepreneurs and the early stage technology community. That's what we've grown Acclivity to become an advisor in.
I take it you've always been a finance person?
Yeah. Unfortunately, no, I don't have a big pivot from something more exciting, but no, I've always been involved in finance.
But if you had to be doing something else at the moment, what do you think you'd be doing?
Yeah, so I always wrestle with this question, and I think that I try as much as possible to not deny what my true passion always was, and that was to do something actually in music, which many people probably won't know or have heard me say before. But yeah, the passion was always to actually do something on the business side, but in the music industry.
Interesting. I'd love to know a bit more about Acclivity. Maybe take us a bit deeper into the sort of work that you do.
Sure. So we, as I mentioned, we're a specialist accountancy and advisory firm working on the sort of early stage entrepreneurial and venture capital backed technology sector for the most part, and we focus specifically on working on companies that are sort of traversing that seed stage to Series B stage of growth, and specifically we do that because our experience is best utilized in that area, but also we like to work with entrepreneurs when they are super early and trying to establish processes, trying to establish how to run and operate a business, and so we help them with all of their compliance. We help them with a lot of the advisory work that comes with running a startup at that stage. So whether that's taking a deep dive into things like fundraising, whether that's through SCIS or EIS, or setting up an option scheme, or doing research and development tax credits. All of those things we will help an early stage founder with until they get to a point where actually we help them try and take a lot of those things back in-house, because they're now of a certain size where good governance would suggest that they shouldn't be outsourcing some of those things.
That was going to be my first question. So you're typically working with companies that I guess don't have a clear finance function. Perhaps maybe they have an office manager or someone who's handling the payroll, etc., but they don't have a CFO, certainly. And you're getting them set up for that CFO or head of finance or finance director or whatever.
Correct. Yeah, and so the idea is that we sort of describe our product as a bit of a holding pattern, to say that let's try and sandbox all of the processes that are going to ultimately become your own finance department. And so whether that's through payment runs or setting up invoicing or bookkeeping or payroll, as you mentioned, a lot of those things are done with the view that we're only going to do this until it makes financial and commercial success sense to do this yourself in-house. And typically we've found more often than not that it's when companies get to sort of Series B side and that level of funding that they tend to have raised enough money to actually build out a proper finance department.
What are the kind of biggest challenges that you're finding? I mean, obviously you listed a whole range of things, but so maybe let's focus more on, are there current challenges that businesses of that nature are going through at the moment that maybe they weren't going through so often 5 years ago?
I mean, there is a whole range of these things, and I don't know about a comparison against 5 years ago, but certainly in the last 12 to 24 months, the landscape has changed quite significantly. I mean, as is quite popularly discussed, there is quite a lot of funding available right now for good ideas and for entrepreneurs that are willing to take big bets, but as as the sort of global economy contracts, we get the feeling that sort of thing will begin to become a little bit tougher. And some of the moonshots that we've experienced in the past, where people are sort of less concerned with fundamentals but more concerned with trying to build out a hypothesis. I think that the fundamental fundraising attitude and aptitude for that sort of thing is going to begin to dry up. And so suddenly people are having to wrestle with the idea of focusing more on fundamentals for the first time, which is no bad thing, but it's certainly something that people may have fallen out of practice with over the last few years because so much of the venture community was focused on taking big moonshots and building impact and reach, whereas now I think things like profitability and unit economics are going to become a lot more important.
Do you think that fundraising is just gone, or is the idea that it's going to move away from the tech sector and into other sectors?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's gone. And frankly, it was always there. I think it's just a case of what the thesis will be that supports a good fundraising story. That has probably evolved. Once upon a time, funding was a scarce commodity, and it was only reserved for companies that were able to display some of these fundamentals and a proper growth story. I think, over the course of the last few years, we were sort of in a period of relative prosperity where actually there was so much funding available that some of those fundamental traits, shall we say, fell by the wayside to some extent, where a lot of investors were happy to support businesses that were taking big and following big audacious goals. But yeah, so I don't think it's going anywhere. I just think that the criteria is going to become stricter.
And what is it about that Series B stage that makes that almost the cutoff point? I know you wouldn't describe it as a cutoff point, but that makes it fundamentally different. A company fundamentally changes pre and post Series B. Yeah.
So it's been designed this way on a thesis of what the individual funding rounds mean. Now, that's not always going to be the same, but our thesis on Series B is that you are now a company that is at the stage where you have established your product market fit. You probably have some significant customers, clients that you're working with, and actually now more than ever, the business is going to be a function of its own efficiencies. Whereas before, the company was kind of a function of its ability to establish product market fit, and a lot of the success or otherwise was based on the individual efforts of the management team or the CEO, and so you were sort of breaking through brick walls as opposed to relying on an operational infrastructure that fuels the business. And so the thesis is, if Series B is when you're raising your first major, say, institutional round of funding, and now, like I said, that will change whether you consider that to be Series A or Series B. But in the old world of Series B, that's at a point where more than ever the company is looking to rely on its own efficiencies and infrastructure to be a successful business, which is when you probably will fall short if you haven't instilled some of these practices in-house.
You've also written a book, The Finance Playbook for Entrepreneurs, and I imagine you take that playbook and apply it to your clients. Can you tell us a bit about the book?
Yeah, sure. So that book was written over lockdown. It was my sort of lockdown project through COVID. I thought it was probably a better use of my time than sort of scanning the whole of Netflix. But the idea behind writing the book was, because we work on the early stage, we get to see entrepreneurs from all sorts of backgrounds, and they come from employment or not employment, straight out of university. Some come straight out of college. Some people have worked their entire career in employment and then want to start their own business in the sort of latter part of their career. But what was becoming abundantly clear is that there was no uniform or accepted way for people to come about the knowledge of how to start and run a business efficiently. Even from the basic decision of what kind of entity should I be setting up? Should I be setting up a partnership or a limited company? These are all things that I think it had just become accepted practice that these are things that you are going to pay for in terms of advice from a professional advisor. So these are just things that either a lawyer will teach you or an accountant will teach you. But there's no real resource to actually go and learn these things yourself if you wanted to. And so the thesis behind the book was that we really wanted to level the starting line, or I certainly wanted to really level the starting line for entrepreneurs of all backgrounds, to say, look, here is a book which is probably the length of a long-haul flight, and you can get on the plane having not known very much about anything to do with finance and running a business, and you can walk off that plane with sort of 10 or 11 immediate things that you can implement and get your head around in an easy to digest way, so that you're sort of starting from 20% into the learning process as opposed to negative 5%.
Are there specific aspects of building a business as an entrepreneur that you think are really not second nature, that really need to be talked through for entrepreneurs? In the example that you gave, or the kind of illustration that you gave, was of people who have obviously worked other jobs before, so they're familiar with a lot of things that have to go on. Was there anything in the book or in putting together the playbook that you really thought, oh, you know what, I bet nobody's thought of this, or the average person doesn't think of this?
Yeah, and it just depends, as you say. Yeah, there are definitely going to be instances where there are entrepreneurs that are familiar with the concepts, but they may not be familiar with the execution. But then similarly, there are situations, and increasingly so now, where some of our clients are coming straight out of college. They're choosing to not go to university and wanting to set up their own business, and so they actually have no exposure at all to any of these kind of concepts. And I think an entrepreneur will resonate with a different chapter in the book depending on how they are wired. And so, there are certain lessons and tips in the book which, for example, they hold the CEO to account to say, the efficiency of your business will only be a function of how willing you are to adhere to the processes that are implemented, at the top. So whether that's expense management, or whether that's, keeping your receipts, and something, what I try and do in the book is amplify and magnify some of the sort of day-to-day mundane tasks into how they are manifest as a reflection of the management's ability to really run a large organization. So those are some of the things that I think some of the more shall we say entrepreneurial entrepreneurs, the ones who sort of focus on the actual trying to shout from the rooftops about what it is that they do, to say, look, you need to have just as much an appreciation for some of these processes and topics, otherwise it's going to be difficult for you to get other people to buy into them.
And now to go back to Acclivity, and it may also tie into the book directly, I'm really interested in talking about technology and your role in implementing technology for companies. How much of a role do you have in doing that?
Yeah, so a lot of the time, again, a privilege of sort of working with the early stage is that sometimes clients are coming to us completely with a blank sheet of paper to say, we're happy for you to design what our technology stack looks like from a accounting and finance perspective. And we more often than not will ask clients to start with using a package like Xero, or a platform like Xero, or QuickBooks, or whichever one they may prefer. And then we will introduce them to a suite of sort of add-on software that we believe is useful for them based on what kind of business they are and what kind of reporting requirements they might have. So a lot of the time, as I mentioned, our clients are backed by investors, and sometimes investors will request that they need certain management reports prepared for them on a monthly, quarterly basis, and so we will set the client up with adequate software to be able to assist them with that. But then it could be something more complex, like inventory management, and then we need to go about finding the right tool for the client for that specific situation. I mean, what's great for us is that because we're not wedded to any particular software, we can go about undertaking a proper research exercise to see which software works best for this particular client. And more often than not, we will be assisting with whether it's payment software or inventory management or expense management software, but typically ones that interact directly with either Xero or whichever bookkeeping platform that we've implemented for them.
I'm interested in whether or not you think that there is a level of obsolescence that essentially is built into some of these tools, or not built in, but to what extent do you need to think about future scale when you're implementing these tools versus just choosing the best tool for right now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think that's also something that I address in the book, because a lot of the times that we see clients scale very quickly, that becomes a very urgent question, because these tools are not made for everybody, and I think there's a bit of a shortcoming in the advisor community to bring that to light, because the assumption is that we probably need to keep promoting platforms and software that we know how to use, as opposed to assuming that there may come a time where it becomes inappropriate for a client. So in certain situations, we've had a client where we've had to tell them that I'm afraid even for what you're doing right now, Xero is not suitable for you, because you need an intricate level of customization or whatever the case may be. And so certainly what we are trying to do more and more of is create content around what comes after Xero and what comes after some of the off-the-shelf packages that you see, to say that, look, whilst we are not experts in necessarily implementing those, we're certainly experts in recognizing when they become a necessity. To your point, that's definitely something that I think needs to be discussed more.
It's possibly one of the hottest topics in the CFO Connect community around when is the right time for an ERP. And it seems like the answer is always absolutely not until you need it, but then the moment you need it, you wish you had it 6 months ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm sure we'll come on to talking about some of the content work that we're doing right now, but so we are sort of taking the lead on creating content around this topic, and specifically because, like I said, we've had clients who, from an optical standpoint, should be squarely in the Xero category. But actually, if you are truly appreciative of the business model that they operate or the needs that they're going to have, you probably would never have started them on Xero in the first place. And so in situations like that, I think it's incumbent upon us, at least in, like, for example, the early stage community, to know what sits on the other side from an ERP standpoint, because there's a lot of ERP software out there, I think, that isn't as intimidating as we're led to believe, and so to implement those earlier, as you say, is sometimes much more of a blessing than waiting until it's critical.
Well, tell us more about the content, the thought leadership that you're putting out. What do we need to know?
Yeah, sure. So as an extension to the book was obviously a establishing of a thesis to say, there's no consistent knowledge around the topics that surround this area of the economy, and so we want to be the ones to bring the best people. Certainly in the book, I wanted to put out our best advice into the book. But then the extension of that was like, okay, well, we work with a network of so many other operators and advisors in this space, be it lawyers or advisors of other nature, tax advisors. So why don't we curate all of the best content on topics that we know are required by our CFO community? So all the CFOs that we work with across our portfolio, some of them ask the same questions, and it just always struck me as something that was slightly structurally incorrect, that there wasn't a sole place that they could go to learn these things. If you happen to know another CFO that had been through the same journey, then they might be able to give you their version, but then that would only be their version. So how would you corroborate that against what it is that you need? So we created a platform called the Finance Department, and you can go to it at thefinancedepartment.co or tfd.community. And essentially there what we are doing is every day, every week, uploading more and more content from experts that we have either worked with or have a relationship with. And our sole brief to them is put together some content for us on something that is wholly ungoogleable. So someone can't, the question that you're answering, that someone couldn't have just Googled. So, whereas you might see that the title sounds like a Google search result, if you actually watch the video, it's much more like someone teaching you something on a sort of nuanced level that you couldn't have picked up from a textbook or from Google. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a platform where that will become the accepted place for people to go and at least have an entry-level knowledge for some of these topics, because what we want to do is take the teaching away from the advisor community, because I think that is the actual nub of what has been wrong with this industry, is that by default the advisor community has been looked at as a sort of teacher as well as an advisor. And accountants and lawyers were never trained to be good teachers. That's certainly not part of the syllabus. Certainly in the chartered accountancy exams I did, there was no section to say, how do you teach this to someone that is not a finance professional? And so, whether you are a non-finance person who happens to be working in the finance department because you're a two-person company, or if you're someone that's very senior from the finance world but just happens to be in your first role in a startup, hopefully our content will allow you to get to the point where you don't feel obliged to spend money to just learn some of the basic topics, whether it's option schemes or fundraising or R&D. And then as a further extension to that, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a community where people can ask questions of each other. So there'll be a community section over there where you might go on there and say, I've just joined as the head of finance for a ride-sharing app, and I'm confused as to what the VAT rate should be for this particular type of transaction. And hopefully another finance person from another ride-sharing app might say, whenever we came across this situation, this was the VAT rate we used. And so it's much more crowdsourced, it's much more peer-to-peer, and the idea is that hopefully you will come with an answer that the crowd will validate was the right answer, as opposed to just going to one advisor who may or may not have ever worked with a ride-sharing company in the past.
So that's the end goal, obviously. How much? If I go there right now, how much content can I expect to find?
Yeah, no, there's a fair amount of content on there actually already. I couldn't tell you the exact number, but it will certainly keep you busy for a while. And there's much more that is going online every day right now. We're finishing off the build of some of the other technical pieces, which will come over the course of the next few weeks, actually, so we're not even that far away. But from a content standpoint, it's an everyday thing. So every day or every week, certainly, there are new bits of content going up.
Wonderful. I think it's a great initiative. So I'm sure many members of the CFO Connect community will head over there and check that out. I hope so. I'd like to take a little detour now into the world of tax, because you are a tax advisor. Maybe, perhaps, why don't you tell us about your work? I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I almost certainly will. Yeah. So how would you describe your work here?
So obviously, as part of my job, there, there's certainly elements of tax that I advise on, and there are certain things that I am more of a specialist on than others. So specifically, things like share option schemes and EIS and SCIS. Are things that I tend to do more complex work in. But I think what you're referring to is sort of the work that I do with government. Indeed. Which is, so I'm an advisor for the Office of Tax Simplification, as well as on an HMRC board as well. And I think that those two roles really came as a result of being an advisor to startups that also happens to run his own business. And so I can give the perspective of an entrepreneur, and I can give the perspective of entrepreneurs, if that makes sense. So I've been doing that for a little while now, and it's a real privilege. It's you get front row access to how government is thinking about tax. Some of the things that they are sensitive to, some of the vulnerabilities that they have, which is great, and the real access that I have is being able to relay to government some of the issues that I see playing out, certainly in my ecosystem. And I've done that, and so and it's really sort of gratifying to see some of that stuff then find its way to the finance bill and other things that get announced by the Chancellor or otherwise.
Why is tax so complicated?
That's a good question. I think I suppose the question is whether it should be or not. I think, and I say this with the utmost humility, because it's not easy to design a tax system, is that just the velocity of change in the economy over the last 30 years is probably the equivalent of the velocity of change over the last 150 years, or the prior 150 years. And so it's hard for the tax system theoretically to keep up with the way that people are going about doing their business and how people go about earning their money. because there is a very real set of decisions and implementations that you need to make to understand whether what you're suggesting can actually be enforced or not. And so I think that what's ended up happening is that we've ended up with a evolving tax system which was designed for a very different type of economy, and is now trying to modernize itself to keep up with the way that people are going about their business now. But inevitably, in the effort of doing so, is outdating itself by virtue of not doing it quickly enough. And so it's. I think that the tax system was never really designed to as quickly evolve and keep evolving as it's needing to now, which is why it's currently in a sort of Frankenstein state right now, which is some legacy policy with some lofty ambitions and some implementation and some not so great implementation.
Do you think everybody, this is a very loose question, but do the right people have the right interests in mind when it comes to tax for there to be positive change?
I think so. I've never seen anything other than the right and positive attitudes from all of my interactions on the various committees that I sit on. Everybody is very committed to making the tax system as welcoming and as easy to understand as possible, and everybody is humble to the problems as well. It's not. I have never come across any aversion to the feedback that we've been giving to say, well, actually, no, it's perfectly fine. It's a you problem, not an us problem. There is always sufficient scope for feedback, and everybody will genuinely listen to things that you have to say. I think sometimes, certainly I'll speak for myself, is sometimes from the perspective of someone that's working with entrepreneurs, we often feel like because we have the loudest voice, the tax system therefore has to evolve to accommodate us, whereas actually the country is much bigger than just the tech community, and so whereas someone from the tech community may not be thinking, how does this affect a middle-aged person living up north who's working in a completely different industry to technology, that is something HMRC does have to think about, and so sometimes it is a function of not recognizing that HMRC is dealing with a national tax policy, whereas we're trying to solve for a policy that affects just our ecosystem, and then it becomes a question of priorities, right? So the technology world and the entrepreneurial community will say that they are leading the charge in moving the country forward, and therefore there should be some prioritization for tax policy and making sure that this country is as welcoming and as competitive as possible, which is true to some extent. But again, that balance is something that really only HMRC is having to worry about, whereas it's quite easy to keep making suggestions. They have to balance it with a sort of national agenda, which is often a tough balance to strike.
Is tax when you're working with early stage startups, high growth companies, at least in goals, I'm sure their goals are to grow as fast as possible, is tax a concern in general? Is it something that just has to be done but it's relatively formulaic, or is it really something that there is a strategic approach to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that certainly in the early stage, it's maybe not as much of a concern as later, as companies that are slightly more mature, and there's a good reason for that. Is often because companies are not making a profit, and so there's very little tax exposure in the first instance. I mean, certainly there are sensitivities to payroll taxes and the taxes associated with issuing things like share options and all of the sort of entry level concerns that you may assume that an early stage business has. But from the perspective of actually sitting down and designing a tax agenda, I think that doesn't come until much later. Yeah, obviously, there are unique circumstances where companies become very profitable very quickly, and suddenly, that does become a concern. But no, as a sort of general answer, the early stage community is not as concerned or as organized, shall I say, when it comes to designing tax policy, and for understandable reasons.
Yeah. And does that change at all when companies start looking at international expansion?
Yes, yeah, and particularly, since Brexit, and we found a lot of companies were having to grapple with changes to a tax system, whereas they weren't fully conversant with the tax system in the first place, and so they were sort of learning, okay, what was the tax system? How has it now changed as a result of Brexit? And actually, there wasn't a lot of great information out there to help entrepreneurs navigate that time, and actually there wasn't a whole lot of great execution either, even if people did understand it theoretically. And so yes, certainly from the standpoint of growing overseas or trading overseas, that does accelerate the company's need to understand tax a little better. But thankfully nowadays there are so many great tools out there that can help you navigate these things. I think maybe even pre-COVID there weren't as many tools to, for example, employ an overseas team. There's loads of those kinds of tools out there now which will teach you about local tax laws and help you operate those things, which is generally a good thing.
Well, I'd love to turn now to our quick-fire questions. There are 4 of them with which we like to finish our interviews. So the first question is, what is one finance tool you couldn't live without? And please don't say Excel. I probably could live without Excel just to know the trauma I'm alleviating myself of. But I would say probably Xero. And the reason I say that is because Xero allows a firm like ours and an advisor like myself to sort of to work with as many companies as we do. I think that's genuinely a unique feature of Xero, and certainly other cloud bookkeeping platforms as well. But that's Xero is the one that we tend to use. I'd say Xero. It's certainly built well to scale for firms.
Correct. Yes, yeah, correct.
If there was one part of your day-to-day you could outsource completely and forget about, what would it be?
I'd say probably personal accounting.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's this is something we're thinking about in terms of implementing for entrepreneurs, but it's personal accounting, I think, is always something that is just a bit of a not-discussed topic, that ultimately, if you have various different things going on, that it's difficult to make sure that your own personal accounting is just as organized as your startup's accounting. So I think that, if I could find a way of reliably outsourcing that, I probably would.
As a non-finance native myself, that is incredibly refreshing to hear, because I just imagine that you have it all completely solved.
No. You take the leap of faith that when it comes to crunch time, you'll be able to do it quickly.
What is the best advice you've ever received?
I'd say as a sort of personal and professional piece of advice there's 2. Probably what gets measured gets managed. That tends to hold people in good stead, to say, if you're measuring something, you can tend to manage it. And whether that's from a business standpoint or from a personal standpoint. And similarly then, as an advisor, I find that, is particularly working with early stage businesses, but actually also this is the one thing that I think in our world we can scale, is to always lead with empathy. So I think that the empathy side of things is a slightly underutilized element within the professional advisor community. And I think that, touch wood, hopefully, is something that has held us in good stead, is that we don't tend to work with hundreds and hundreds of clients, and the reason for that is because I don't want us as a firm to ever dilute the empathy we can extend to a founder or to an entrepreneurial team. So those would be 2 that traverse both personal and professional. That's
a really interesting perspective. It's we talk to a lot of in-house CFOs as well as consultants, and it's something that a lot of them are dealing with at the moment, is exactly as you say, empathy, but obviously for teams, for their direct finance team and the wider company, and how can you show more empathy and help others grow. It's really interesting to hear it from the perspective of essentially an outsourced CFO, and still feeling that empathy towards the company, I guess, more rather than specific individuals.
Yeah, no, I think it's again, another feature of early stage companies is that these entrepreneurs typically are at their most vulnerable because they will have either just left a very lucrative job or career, and they're trying to make something of themselves or something of an idea that they have, or a burning passion or desire that they have to see something exist in this world. Particularly with the vacuum of knowledge that I'm trying to fill through the book, or we're trying to fill through the finance department, to then sort of have this whole sector of your entrepreneurial journey that you're really not sure how to learn about, and that there are so many cracks that you can fall through by getting things wrong. I think our job really is to make sure that we are empathetic to that vulnerability and that fear, and to say that, look, we will look after XYZ for you, or we will give you access to the tools to make sure that you're not as intimidated by those topics. And I think that that ultimately is something that I think resonates with our portfolio and our community generally. Is
that also a reason why you enjoy working with early stage startups more, because you're actually in touch with someone's dreams, or a group of people's dreams?
Yeah, and I never underestimate that, because whether it's their dream and something that they really want to see make happen, or because of just how much it means to that person. It's very different to working with a CFO who is a career CFO and is not really invested in the mission of the business, because that's their job. For a lot of our clients, this is really everything for them, and that it's a very different dynamic, which I much more enjoy than the alternative.
And finally, which other finance directors do you talk to or learn from regularly?
Yeah, I mean, loads. So all of the CFOs of our portfolio we speak to fairly regularly. All companies that which I'm not able to disclose who they are, but they're all wonderful people and very very switched on, and we learn just as much from them as they hopefully do from us. I again very fortunate to have access to senior finance people and economists and things in the government. So it's always interesting to speak to them to understand a policy narrative, which often is not discussed in that granularity with people on the ground like us. And so I do get that access. And just one example, a few weeks ago, HMRC released their guidance on cryptocurrency, for example, and there was a little bit of confusion amongst people as to what it really meant, and how they're supposed to understand this. And I found myself within a few days speaking to the person that wrote it, and said he was talking to me about exactly what his thought process was, and how he'd be happy to take any feedback if we heard it. And so that kind of access is really gratifying as well. So between our portfolio CFOs and people in government, and just generally people that we work with every day, it's an everyday privilege.
Asif Ahmed, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.